Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast from the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind's resident Somali fraudster. I'm so good at it, you didn't even know I was from Somalia. I'm joined this week by the OG crew, managing editor Mike Sabo and publisher and president Ryan Williams. And we are going to dip first into a story that's been making the rounds for a little bit. So you probably have already heard about this. It's something that's been going on for some time, but was really raised into the national consciousness by Chris Rufo and some of his colleagues at the Manhattan Institute. And that is the aforementioned Somali fraud in Minnesota. The background to this generally is Minnesota's Medicaid Housing Stabilization Services program. This is one of the most, I think, sort of open and freewheeling aid programs in the country by all accounts. And I think Minnesotans, including liberal Minnesotans, would agree and take this as a point of pride, in fact, that there are pretty low barriers in this program to getting funds and aid. During COVID, especially, it was taken advantage of, as were many aid programs that were opened up even wider during COVID. But this one seems to have been just raked over the coals. Even before the program went live in 2020, its annual estimated price tag was $2.6 million. But now, after a major court case and a number of other investigations, it just seems as if this thing is being taken advantage of at a wild level. We're talking not simply we got funds for a school program and we skimmed a little off the top, but rather we set up an entire imaginary organization for, take your pick, for housing, for autistic relief, and all of that was basically a front for just getting state funds and in many cases sending them back home. And I say back home because the other part of this is that a lot of these fraudsters are from Somalia. Minnesota has a big Somali population, around 80,000 people that have been making their way over there since the 90s. There was a civil war in Somalia. I think I speak here as the kind of podcast host who has just learned about a lot of this in the last week, being generous to myself. But basically, there was a civil war in Somalia, and many Somalis ended up in St. Paul and other parts of Minnesota, Minneapolis. And the biggest court case in this scandal is the Feeding Our Future case, in which there are 78 defendants who have been indicted, and the vast majority of those are Somalian. There are 7 guilty verdicts and 50 guilty pleas to date in that case, and it establishes at least or up to, I guess, $300 million in fraud committed almost exclusively by Somali defendants. So this is naturally a touchy subject, and the fraudsters in question have made use of that fact. When questions and concerns were raised about some of these cases beforehand, they were often rebutted with accusations of racism. How dare you ask whether this menacing pirate taking over your ship really is the captain now or not? That's a movie reference for those of you who haven't been online in a while. Anyway, what is the balance sheet of all this? President Trump has announced the termination of the temporary protected status of Somali immigrants. House Speaker Mike Johnson has been talking about this. Joe Thompson, Minnesota's acting U.S. attorney, says most of these cases, unlike a lot of Medicare fraud and Medicaid fraud cases, naturally aren't just overbilling. They are often just purely fictitious companies solely created to defraud the system. And that's unique in the extent to which we have that here in Minnesota. So this is a major, major scandal, kind of emblematic, I think, of a whole bunch of stuff that's been in the news and therefore is obviously inviting all sorts of claims and counterclaims from the usual political suspects. Representative Ilhan Omar herself from Somalia has been accusing Trump of vicious and disgusting racism for making this a national issue. But of course, it seems to be a national issue whether Trump makes it one or not. Where to go with all this, you guys? What sticks out to you? What do you think we should highlight, and how ought Trump to proceed in this ongoing case?
I just think of, Federalist 2 comes to mind, and I know, written by John Jay, talking about, the same religion, the same culture, the same traditions, all these kinds of things. And obviously there was some, rhetorical overplay even at that time. With, I think, still the country was, he was writing that the country was, I think, 98% Protestant. But, there were certainly some differences. But I think he wanted to highlight an important fact, which is, one people, the Republican people, they have to have, these same things in common. And so I think you're looking at what's going on in Minnesota right now, and you're looking at essentially the culture of an entirely different country, of a third world country that, has certainly its issues, basically being imported to America. And we're seeing kind of the results of what that happens. You look at, the problem of citizenship, where a lot of these people seem to, their first allegiance is still back home and not to America. I mean, that's where they're shipping their money to. As I think Ryan Thorpe, I think that's what his name, who wrote this really good City Journal piece with Chris Rufo, and really kind of highlighted, all these problems. The U.S. Attorney Thompson, Spencer, that you referenced, said, from feeding our future to housing stabilization services and now autism services, these massive fraud schemes form a web that has stolen billions of dollars in taxpayer money. Each case we bring exposes another strand of this network. And even if you look at just like autism alone, the autism claims to Medicaid in Minnesota skyrocketed in recent years from $3 million in 2018 to $399 million in 2023. I mean, that is astounding, just the range of the money that's been drained, from the U.S., from where it should be to actually helping, American citizens to another country. And it's not only to another country. It's, I think like you've said, too, I mean, the money has even been directed toward Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda-linked Islamic terrorist group. So, I mean, this is a huge, huge issue that has massive ramifications. Especially ramifications for, Tim Walz, ran obviously with Kamala Harris. He's running, I think, for a third term for governor in Minnesota. I mean, this is happening directly under his watch. So, I mean, the buck really stops with him. And it just shows, the problem of the Biden administration, the Walz, Kamala Harris kind of regime of, really open borders, not really caring who you're letting in this country, and basically wanting to go the route of what's happening in Britain today. And I just think, that the Trump administration and people like Chris Rufo are gearing up. They're understanding the problem this is. They're pointing it out, and they want to do something about it. So I think this is just one of the critical key issues of our time.
Yeah, Al-Shabaab, surprisingly not one of the Somali cuisine dishes that have also been under discussion in the wake of this scandal, but actually a violent terrorist organization that, yes, is being funded by some of this money that's getting siphoned out of the U.S. government's treasury.
What do they eat at Al-Shabaab cookouts? Al-kebabs?
Oh, yeah.
I knew something like that was coming.
Al-kebabs, yeah, exactly.
And I can't remember if there was much reporting about it, but another thing from recent years that has to be reckoned with, and it is not exclusive of the Somalis in Minnesota, is just the oceans of cash that went out for COVID relief and the level of fraud, the necessary level of fraud that will be there just as a matter of percentage, human nature being what it is and lax oversight being what it is. So it's a fraud on top of numerous frauds in recent years. And finally, you mentioned Ilhan Omar, Spencer. My favorite was her reaction on, I think she was on CNN maybe, or MSNBC, doesn't really matter. But her response when confronted with this was, well, we set up these new programs and we just didn't really have time to put proper guardrails in place. This happens with new programs.
I love that because if this happens with new programs, perhaps that's a good reason not to cast them up at random, almost without thinking. Like anytime any major issue or opportunity arises, that was the part, yeah, that kind of got to me is okay. Everyone's talking about the fact that these are Somalis, and there are some like serious uh, immigration issues that are raised by this that are sort of good for Trump and activate a by now familiar set of accusations and counter accusations from one party to the other. But before you even get into that, you do have to take stock of the COVID of it all, the COVID fraud dimension, which is one of those things from COVID that we've all decided collectively to memory hole, not just the left, who in many cases were responsible, but everybody kind of doesn't want to remember or recriminate about COVID. It was just such an ugly, traumatic time for us all that we've kind of agreed to forget about it and move on to other political questions. But it was, for those with eyes to see, a really stark illustration of where the progressive project ultimately arrives. Like the way I ultimately came to understand that whole sequence of months and years was that this is a sort of stopgap. The stopgaps have been ripped away by this state of emergency, and we've been so effectively convinced that the rules just do not apply in this moment that now we get to see what the public safety maximalists would like to do if they had their druthers. And one of the things that they would like to do is just crank open the spigot on government funding for social projects. That's something that they will often sort of say they want, but not be able to do at the fullest extreme. Similarly, the whole idea that you need to shut yourself in to avoid getting the flu is something that was presented as a kind of emergency measure, but is actually the philosophical implication of the way the hierarchy of values that progressives had already set up for themselves, that were being kind of rolled and scaled back by our constitutional protections, such as they still endure, hang on by a fingernail. But once you kind of take those guardrails away, you see that, oh no, this is basically the kind of life that progressive ideology leads to. And if you think I'm being histrionic about that, you have only to look in the New York Times and find a public health argument for pushing self-driving cars full speed ahead on everybody immediately, because fewer people, it seems, perhaps, will die in car accidents if we go full self-driving. Now, I think that there's probably a lot of questions about that still to be answered, but before you even get into that debate, there's this thing about, well, like public safety trumps all of your other concerns. Some people like to drive cars. Some people like the freedom that brings. But the public safety imperative is simply too strong, which is kind of the logic that's like at work here in general. So then you have that layered on top of the stuff that you were talking about, Ryan, that like everyone from everywhere is the same all at once. And there's simply no difference or a hierarchy of goodness in ways of life, let alone leaving aside race for a second. You don't even have to start with race before you get into culture and talk about like these are countries that people flee for a reason. They're run in certain ways. They operate according to certain principles. And if you take those principles and you transplant them en masse into a state that has basically decided to allow the government to dispense money according to its like most favored races and protected classes, you're going to get massive fraud. So this really is like a kind of a collision of several different leftist lies, basically about reality, coming crashing into the basic facts on the ground. So I guess my next question is like, is this something that Trump will ultimately succeed with? Like, is this helpful for Trump politically, that he has taken this issue and run with it, or will it look so nasty and mean that he's picking on those poor Somalis? Like, how do you think the politics of this are going to shake out?
I think he does have to be, a little bit careful with it. But no, I think overall, in principle, I mean, this is the perfect issue for Trump. Immigration was one of the things he ran on, going back to 2016, and the things he talked about even before that. But, it was immigration, trade, and foreign policy. Those are been his basically big three pillars ever since coming on the scene really strongly as a Republican in 2015, 2016. So I think, he needs to tie this to, and I keep going back to the piece Jeremy Carl wrote for us a couple weeks ago now, 2-3 weeks ago, where he needs to tie this to kitchen table issues, to housing prices going up, to affordability, towards, hey, the U.S. isn't a debt problem, and they're helping precipitate that. They're even making it worse. So for you, the citizen, so I think that's what he has to do, is really tie this to not only, is this a breach of the public trust, but how is this actually harming, American citizens? What is their treasure being taken away? What are the things that they now don't have? The public trust being broken, highlighting the importance of the rule of law. So I think all those things he can highlight. But again, I think he does have to tie it to, the well-being of American citizens.
It also makes the case for, well, there's many reasons to embrace it, but to institute a fairly punitive tax on remittances, which would cut down on this sort of problem. It would also encourage more assimilation, because I'm actually stealing this point from, I think, Christine Rosen on the Commentary podcast, so I'll credit where it's due. But she made the point a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, it was really hard to get to the United States, and you didn't have much contact with the world you left behind. So the pressures to assimilate were much higher. Whereas now everyone has a smartphone that you can stay in touch with home. You can send them a lot of your money through Cash App or whatever. So I think it would be it has the dual use of being one more prod towards more assimilation, that is to truly cut you off in a big way, and to tie you to the new state that you're in, because your primary purpose is if your primary purpose is really to use America, whether through fraud or through honest employment, as a cash machine to send back to a lot of relatives at home, you're kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And so it's one of the many reasons why assimilation, especially in these enclaves, is delayed. And then it has the added benefit of, you'd recapture some of the fraud through remittance tax, to the extent that fraud was present, as it always is to some extent, sometimes worse, sometimes not as bad.
What do you think the tax rate should be on money sent to Al-Shabaab? 110%, I think. Yeah, exactly.
120 if possible.
This whole thing does remind me a little bit of the Haitians eating the dogs and the cats. Like, this was one of the things that Trump got first dinged and then kind of amusingly lauded for during one of the presidential debates, that there was this Haitian enclave in Ohio, and he went off, as you will recall, about in Ohio, they're eating the dogs. He's never sounded more New York than when he said this. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. And everyone made fun of him. But if, it was sort of directionally or gesturally true that this was a terrible high crime situation in Ohio that was being created again by these like pockets. Yeah, it's a really good point about the assimilation. Like, somehow you do have to, if you're going to shelter a bunch of people who have fled persecution or disaster in their home country, like, you're going to have to also make them Americans. One of our ongoing themes. Another one of our ongoing themes, and this is actually a really helpful transition, so thanks I know you intended to set me up for that, so let's appreciate it, is integrating these sort of isolated discussions about particular immigration issues into a larger strategic theory of the case, a way that we are guided towards certain ends in our relationship with other countries and with the world insofar as it exists as a whole. And that is the topic of this newly released national security strategy, which has been generating a lot of discussion. This is a kind of document that new administrations put out but this one differs in meaningful and interesting ways, both from the norm, the status quo of how these strategic statements of policy priorities typically go, but also from Trump 1.0. I think it's fair to say this is a sort of shift that's reflective of many of the things we've discussed. I'm going to try and lay out its overarching logic and structure as best I can, but I do think it's worth your time to just read it in full. It's 29 pages long, really, and big-ish type, so it's kind of like reading a Supreme Court decision. Like, it is aimed at the public, and you probably should take a look to figure out what's going on. But a few different things. The cover letter, interestingly, and this is why I thought it was an interesting segue, Trump has a cover letter in the front that begins among his accomplishments by listing his border patrol success. He says he stopped, quote unquote, the invasion of our country by immigrants coming over illegally across the southern border and elsewhere, which shows, I think, that he's thinking about, and this strategy tends to think about questions of migration and America's place in the world as on a continuum with its place in the global economy and its place in foreign policy. That is to say, our military strategy, both for deterrence and for actual engagement, should it occur. One of the things that the report itself kind of draws attention to is that whereas these kinds of documents are famous for providing so-called laundry lists of ideal American priorities, this one attempts to eschew the grab bag of every possible thing that we might like to do or have in the world, but instead asks, what do and should we want? What kinds of resources do we have to get what we want? And where can we get what we want? And the document is, broadly speaking, kind of structured in that way. It lays out some of the things that America and American foreign policy should be aimed at achieving. And then it goes through some of the advantages and current challenges that we have to achieving those goals. And then you get sort of a series of regions and what America should try to do in each of those regions. I think it's fair to say that all three of those subjects are treated with some latitude. That is to say, intentionally, the report is less specific about particular aims because one of its governing ideas is that we want to be, as the text goes, pragmatic but not pragmatist, that pacific but not dovish, right? In other words, there are virtues that we should pursue without making them into a kind of dogma or unyielding theoretical ideology. We instead want to leave ourselves kind of latitude to maneuver as different scenarios come up. Having said that, here are some of the noteworthy things. First and foremost, the report says, we want the continued survival and safety of the United States as an independent, sovereign republic whose government secures the God-given natural rights of its citizens and prioritizes their well-being and interests. In keeping with that non-ideological bent, this is not an isolationist document exactly, but it does emphasize that Trump has negotiated all these various peace deals and strikes the tone of we would like to keep, first of all, our own nation, and then our hemisphere, and then, to the extent possible, the world in a state of security and prosperity. And that's kind of our aim here. And to that end, something we touched on last time, but will now, I think, probably discuss in more detail, becomes the first, I think, kind of regional priority. And that is this new Monroe Doctrine, or the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Enlist and expand our base of allies and power and relationships in the Western Hemisphere. That's kind of how the strategy, I think, views our main priority or our main sphere, theater of action. And then we go region by region till we go to Asia and Europe and the Middle East. A few things that will be surprising in each of these areas, I guess. In Asia, the big thing is that this is not a Cold War 2.0 with China. exactly. There is a theory of the history of U.S.-China relations that basically takes it that we entered into this economic partnership, or rather relationship with China when they were a much, much poorer country, hoping that opening them to the world would also liberalize them. That didn't happen, famously. And so now we're contending with extremely powerful, in many cases adversarial, and certainly disingenuous great power in Asia. And we should put leverage on our allies in the region, like Japan and Australia, to help us to be to forcefully put an end to some of China's more predatory practices. At the same time, this is not about like, let's end the communist regime in China, or let's make this the defining feature of our foreign policy for all times and in all ways. The other part of this that will surprise, or has surprised people, is the promoting European greatness section, which is about our allies in Europe and both their responsibilities to take care of their own problems, but also the ways in which they are failing at a civilizational level. I mean, this is a severe and forthright indictment of the mass migration problem, the threats to free speech, the surveillance and the statism that Europe has been facing in the era of, I would even say post the era of mass migration for Europe. Then we close out, I guess, with the Middle East and Africa. The report, or the strategy, views the Middle East as decreasing in importance for a number of reasons, including energy diversity, that America is now a net energy exporter and oil has less of a priority, and therefore this is like less of a big deal of a region. It does include as one of our goals that Israel remains secure, but also that there be no more nation-building wars, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, in Africa, basically it says we shouldn't try to export liberal values. We should instead be focused on building productive economic relationships. But again, two big bullet points are, we're not ranged against China in a kind of US Soviet Union rehash, but rather attempting to rebalance our relationship with China so that it is righteous and not predatory. And then also we are calling on Europe to step up its game, or expect a certain degree of or not rely on us, I suppose, to fund and subsidize and defend a Europe which is continuing to slide into civilizational decay. Did I get all of that right, do you guys think? And what do you make of all of this and the reaction to it? Discuss.
Yeah, I think you got all that right, Spencer. One of the emphases in this document, which was principally drafted by our friend and colleague Mike Anton, although these things always go through the interagency process, and especially they go up to the various cabinet heads. With this document, especially at Defense, Mike was working on it at State, and so it gets revised, and Politico reports that the China section was defanged a bit by Bessent and the Treasury Department, according to, I think, mostly anonymous sources. Which I suppose at a certain level is understandable. I don't know that you can draw the conclusion from that Bessent somehow is just another Wall Streeter who wants to, make a lot of money off China once he leaves office. I think it may have a lot to do with ongoing negotiations with China about crucial materials, stuff to make batteries, a whole host of issues that the Trump administration is trying to negotiate with China, with tariffs hanging over as one of the sticks they're using. So it's possible they didn't want to exacerbate their negotiating position with China, and thus decided to draw down the rhetoric a little bit in the China section. I think the Africa part is pretty interesting because it's the push solution to the mass migration problem. It emphasizes seeking out trade partners in Africa and helping them develop and become more prosperous, rather than, as you said, Spencer, exporting modern woke liberalism under the guise of various aid programs and NGOs and all the rest. So it could, if it was successful, and it would be a long-term project, if you make Africa more prosperous, there will be less of a reason for a lot of Africans to leave Africa. And so you would help the supply end of the mass migration problem. One of the subheadings was I think it's the era of mass migration or mass immigration is over. Quite a declaration, but I think it seems to be the trend in the West. We've discussed this weeks and weeks ago in light of Chris Caldwell's piece about the UK. You have France and Britain both in kind of slow motion deterioration. Their major parties are completely in flux because they have utterly failed to control their migration problem, and they've been importing at much larger scale the problems that we see in Minnesota with the Somali ethnic enclave. You have problems in Britain and France and across Europe of skyrocketing crime from a certain segment of countries who have had lots of immigrants come from them to Europe in recent years. The left is freaking out about the Europe section because it mentions that it is entirely possible that Europe will bear little resemblance to the Europe of many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, in as few as 20 years from now. That is to say, it's becoming less European. That's sort of the language used in NSS. And that's a commonsensical fact that everyone is observing, including Europeans. But to say such a thing is to imply that there's some ethnos component to a nation state, and that, again, that you're treating peoples as distinct and having different habits and mores and cultures and religions. And that's, of course, against the rules on the left. So it's gotten some interesting praise across the spectrum on the right. The Commentary podcast crew liked it, not unreservedly, but they liked it. John Podhoretz seemed to suggest that Bridge Colby must have written it, but we know better. I'm sure Bridge had a hand in some of the sections, but again, it was principally drafted out of state by Anton and some of his team members. It also trashed wonderfully the increasingly anti-American and anti-Western civilization NGOs and in transnational institutions, and encouraged Europe and America to abandon and dismantle and stop, as it's put in the report, lashing ourselves, a good phrase, I thought, to these institutions that are hostile to the American way of life and hostile to the nation state itself. So it's kind of a, what's the opposite of a wet dream? Well, it's a nightmare for the left. It also mentions great power, sort of balance of power. And so it's sort of Metternickian in a way, which causes all sorts of palpitations on the left as well. But from our point of view, I think I can speak for both of you guys. It's a return to sanity, and long overdue. And I told everyone they should go read National Security Strategy from Biden to get a sense for the contrast. There's all sorts of stuff in that one about climate change and racial equity globally and all that sort of stuff. None of that nonsense is in the new one. But I would actually encourage people just to go take a look at the George W. Bush administration's NSS, maybe from term 2. It's a stark contrast. And so I don't think there's really any going back from this. It's going to set a lot of things in motion, as the first Trump administration did as well, that I think will redound to America's benefit and to the West's benefit. And I think that the doomsday predictions from the left are wrong for 2 reasons. One, they don't really take human nature or the differences of peoples seriously. And on the second aspect of the left's criticism of it is incorrect, or it's incorrect because the left seems to assume that we were on this wonderful path ever upwards to the erosion of sovereignty, the ascent of transnational legal bodies. And that's just not how history or human nature works. So it also, the document recognizes a new state of affairs that we, the United States, or the liberal internationalist coalition across the Atlantic, the document acknowledges the failure of those institutions to affect the world that they wanted, and the reassertion of normal human nature and the normal trajectory of nations looking after their interests. To acknowledge that fact is not to throw out this wonderful rules-based international order that's kept the world peaceable since the end of World War II, but it's realistic about what sort of world we're actually dealing with.
No, I think, Ryan, I mean, I certainly would agree with your assessment of this. It's, kind of a world-shaking kind of document. I mean, it really sets the stage. It really looks at reality, and that's something that I think, liberals, I mean, we talk about they're progressives and this and that and always progressing up. I mean, I just think, they're living in the past. They're living in just kind of a post-Cold War era that they just don't understand. They can't see reality in 2025 at all. Some of the principles I'll talk about, and one jumped out to me immediately, predisposition to non-interventionism. And the document, cites actually the principles of the Declaration. So it goes from kind of, a Tom Westian kind of, natural rights view and directly links that to an aspect of foreign policy, which is that, we should be predisposed to not intervening in the affairs of other countries. Now, with prudence and everything, that dictates certainly what we should do in certain circumstances, but our overall approach should certainly just be non-interventionism. At the same time, this isn't some kind of, Ron Paul libertarian kind of like knee-jerkism, but it's certainly nothing close to neoconservatism, overly hawkish, anything like that either. Some of the other things that, it talks about, the era of mass migration is over, like you said, Ryan, protection of core rights and liberties. It's talking more about, really, I think Hamilton in Federalist 11 were talked about, trade and the importance of that. He talks about balanced trade, economic security, and really, reshoring our domestic manufacturing, making us not, dependent on other nations, especially ones that are really our adversaries at the end of the day. And some of the, the commentary, I think, has been very, very good. Nathan Penkovsky had a great piece this morning at Compact. Some great lines. He talks about, possibly the NSS's most possibly important feature is that it rips off the noble lie of the whole post-war era. There isn't a unified West stretching across the Atlantic anymore. There's a contest between liberalism and what Samuel Huntington describes as multiculturalism. And this is interesting. The document reflects a conclusion that the United States is now outmatched by China. In order to beat China, the United States needs to regain its civilizational confidence in Republican political culture and to be joined by allies that have done the same. So there's, Penkovsky sees how China was treated a little bit differently, that possibly it's pessimistic. I know that I think Angelo Codevilla was certainly writing about that before he passed, about the difference in missile capabilities alone. Penkovsky talks about one cannot risk a confrontation with China because the position of the United States is naturally precarious to emerge victorious. So he's talking there about what the document says, say, about Taiwan, and even about Taiwan. It kind of brings what Trump has said to just other countries in general about, you need to kind of pay your fair share in these alliances, and NATO especially. And it brings that same kind of principle there to China. It's, look, if we do need to do something, we're not going to go it alone. That's not possible. That's not going to be the way forward. But I would say in general, this document looks at the way the world actually is. It's interesting, even, the Straussian in me just looks at how the different, regions are numbered, whether that was purposeful or not. Western Hemisphere is first, which makes sense. Asia is number 2, and then promoting European greatness is number 3. And number 4 is actually the Middle East, which that is a massive just kind of shift in priorities and a jumbling of, a difference in, where our focus should be now, as it was, say, in 2003, and that we need to look at, again, the world the way it is now. That's based in reality. It's based on securing our national interests, and I think especially compared to some of the previous NSSs in other administrations, I think this is definitely a very good approach going forward.
Some further reading for folks from the archives of CRB, I would recommend oldies but goodies. Leo Strauss and American Foreign Policy by Tom West, which Mike Sabo mentioned Tom West, so just flag that for everyone. That's from 2004. And then I forget when it was written. I think it was right around the same time, but Charles Kessler's Democracy and the Bush Doctrine would be a good thing to revisit. And then and I do mean all of Angelo Codavilla's essays on policy from the Claremont Review of Books. I mean, this sort of stuff informed the writing of it because it's just palpable, as Rod Dreher put in the European Conservative. The direct authorship is not claimed, but Michael Anton's fingerprints are all over it. And I would say, by way of one step removed, so are Angelo Codavilla's. That opening section, which discusses what is a strategy, which you would think an elementary thing like that need not be put in an NSS, but our foreign policy class and clerisy, as Mike has called them, have thought in a kind of diluted netherworld for so long, right and left versions both, that to spell out, okay, a strategy is a prioritized list of things that you want. You can't want everything. That's not a strategy. So it tries to make set up some priorities. And then you have to, those are your ends, your purposes of the whole thing. And then you have to figure out what means you have and link them. I mean, that's vintage Angelo. And it's good to see some common sense, John Quincy Adams, Angelo Codavillian influences in our national security strategy. It's long overdue.
Yeah, the friendly line of criticism that I've seen about this is that, to summarize, it doesn't get specific enough in its commitments. That's the stuff you'll read in like kind of more right-leaning outlets that are friendly to Trump, that we are not signaling here to our allies that they can absolutely rely on us in X, Y, or Z scenario. The Taiwan one is a good example. That's a hypothetical that's often floated, but there are others that we can imagine. And some of the critics have been saying, like, well, why we need to be more like forthright and definite about these scenarios. And despite the fact that this was primarily written by Mike Anton, I don't have any insight into this. So I'm only speaking for myself when I say I think that is by design to a certain extent. Like, I think, for one, committing yourself in advance to specific courses of action in specific scenarios is imprudent for a whole host of reasons. We can remember Obama's bright red line. We can remember other kind of commitments that we've had to then roll back on because the conditions on the ground, as they often do, like, complicated matters and made our best course of action something different. So that's one thing. And then, of course, the other part of this is, like, that is actually not the kind of commitment that people look to this document for. Like, that would be my deeper level response to this critique is, I see how our allies need to be able to rely on us, but I kind of think this document gets across to our allies that they can rely on us, while not also, like, writing a bunch of checks that nobody really will. Like, what would that buy us? Maybe a little bit of momentary goodwill. But the truth of the matter is that, like, when the rubber meets the road, these sorts of documents never have dictated the step-by-step military strategy. So I think it's actually kind of a smart move not to make this about, like, we have the following, 5 intentions in X, Y, and Z scenario, but instead to say, like, yeah, means and ends, right? How should we think about the world, and what kinds of resources do we have to go about doing what we want? It's certainly a signal of a change. I mean, I sort of mentioned this at the outset. Like, it's a departure from the norm, the bipartisan norm throughout, like, the post-war era, but it's also a departure from specifically kind of the Republican norm. Not altogether, not a clean break. I think it's clear that that Anton's and the Trump administration's way of thinking about, like, who our allies are basically remains the same. But Mike, I think your point about numbered lists is, like, quite astute. It's an important one. Like, this is an ordering of priorities. for, at least for America's proactive action. Maybe not necessarily, we can't predict what's going to happen. So our reactions to things as they come up, and the report says this at some point, we might focus on different areas should events transpire that lead us to. But if we're thinking about what kinds of policies are we pursuing now in the world as it is actively, yes, this Monroe Doctrine idea of the Western Hemisphere is clearly the first thing. And then, we are concerned about our relations with the Eastern Hemisphere. And Europe is kind of we're basically saying we can't count on you, so we're not going to make that. We're not going to put a bunch of weight on our hope that Europe will reform itself. It's a pretty striking move into a new era of foreign policy, which Trump has been signaling for a while. I think, and Vance has also been kind of in some of his speeches previewing this. But this, I think, makes it really in a very clarifying way, kind of brings it all into one structure. So we should just briefly touch on, before we close out here, one last topic, which is the big A word, affordability. This is something that Zoran Mamdani talked a lot about in his election, and it's now become a major kind of issue for both the right and the left. We are going to run a, to me, very interesting piece about this by this guy, Russ Green, who I believe is a first-time author for us, and he's going to be talking about one of his great themes that he's tweeted about before as well, which is total boomer luxury communism. This idea that our government programs almost exclusively funnel money upward generationally from the young to the old, and this creates a kind of gridlock and stagnancy in our economy that's causing a bunch of people, regardless of their political affiliation, to feel pain. And this sense that people have that things are too expensive and it's not possible to live comfortably and also sanely in an American middle-class family, that has been growing, I think, for some time. And one of the things that keen observers said about Mamdani's win was, okay, this guy might be a bit of a ridiculous, a ridiculous fellow, but if all you can say about him is he's, a communist or he's a socialist or whatever, you're not grasping what his victory represents. It represents the fact that there is this major groundswell of sentiment that the economy is not doing well. It's one of Trump's signature issues, and it hasn't yet kind of come. He hasn't brought his policy to bear on this issue in the way that he has on immigration. There's a poll out from Politico that says 1 in 5 Trump voters think the economy is his responsibility. The percentage of voters based on their vote in the 2024 general election who say the economy is Joe Biden's fault versus Donald Trump's. So basically the statute of limitations on blaming the Biden administration for inflation and the state of the economy is running out. Trump holds full responsibility. 18% of Trump voters answered that. And then mainly Trump, some Biden. It was 7% of Trump voters versus 53% of Harris voters said that Trump holds full responsibility for the state of the economy. So I guess we should just briefly say a little bit about, what this presages. I never know how to say that word. We should remark upon this fact that this is emerging as one of the signal issues for all political actors in going into 2026. What do you guys make of this?
We sort of touched on this in recent weeks, maybe just tangentially, but I think the Trump administration is now very focused on this because they want the trend lines going in the right direction, that is affordability increasing for the voting constituency that is likely to help the Republicans hold the House if they do. And for the vibes to shift a bit on this, because as you said, Spencer, the public opinion is sort of starting to turn against Trump on kitchen table issues. And so they want to reverse this trend. Housing remains kind of a sticky one. I was looking at some of these numbers because everyone's talking about this now, and there's a lot of good substackery going on about this from people who know a lot about this sort of stuff and have watched this for years. And that is, I think maybe 20 or 30 years ago, the average home price was about 3 times what I guess you could call a bottom rung of the upper middle class income, or top rung of the middle class income. So that would mean, if that were to hold today, rough back of the napkin, your average home price across the country would be 3x your annual income if you made about 200 grand a year. So you're already way up in the top 5% of income earners. And so this is felt palpably across the spectrum, especially when interest rates, though not historically high on 30-year mortgages, are nonetheless much higher than they've been over the last 25 or 30 years, which had pretty astronomically low interest rates. So the young people feel like they can't get into houses. Their grocery bills have seemed to have doubled over the last 10 years or so, but especially during Biden's COVID watch and the Bidenflation numbers. And so Trump, wants to turn all of these things around. And for a month or so, he was just saying, he was kind of doing what the Biden administration did, which is, don't believe your lying eyes when you look at your grocery bill. It's actually not
that was real bad. That was the worst, I think.
So they're trying to change tack. I think Trump was he in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania or Detroit maybe yesterday or today. So they're trying to hit this theme more. But the macro numbers are a bit out of their control. I mean, he successfully goaded Powell into dropping interest rates for 3 cycles running, but it has not really filtered down into the housing market or the 30-year mortgage market all that much. They've ticked down a little bit. It's one of the curses of the Fed. When I was at Hillsdale, we had there's a great collection of economists there, all free market of various stripes, Austrian and all the rest. But one of the great ones there, who's great because he's a lot of fun and funny, Ivan Pongrasic, described the folly of Federal Reserve setting of interest rates. And maybe I brought up this analogy years ago on the podcast. For all of you OG listeners, forgive me for repeating myself. But he said the Fed trying to target interest rates to maintain their dual mandate, which is low inflation and a decent amount of growth, is like trying to shoot a duck with a shotgun through a video camera on a 2-minute delay. You're always in front of or behind the duck. Maybe once in a generation you kill the duck, but the rest of the time you're always calibrating with imperfect tools. So finally, I think we talked about this, but it's why Trump has exempted certain stuff from tariffs to try to get a handle on this affordability thing. But a lot of levers need to go in the right direction to turn this around. And the last one, maybe mass deportations, should have a slightly deflationary effect on housing prices. The question is, how many do you need to do, and how long does it take to happen once you do it? And that, my friends, is a topic that it's sort of like the Fed, right? You're predicting that sort of thing is very difficult, but continuing to deport folks who are crowding into, especially the rental market, should help. And then aside from all that, is something that the federal government has a little bit of influence over, but not as much as they'd like, which is building new housing. Done very well here in Texas, done terribly in California and Manhattan. So I don't know. That's not a great crisp answer, but the affordability question has so much to do with people's general feeling about the economy, which is always pretty linked to how they vote, or at least the marginal sort of independent middle of the road voters vote. If they feel anxious about their prospects, financial and economic prospects, after the incumbent president's been around for 2 years, they're not likely to reward him with votes down ticket.
Yeah, it's really hard as a president to actually fix the economy. It's really easy to mess it up, and you're guaranteed to get punished or rewarded for it, whether it's your fault or not. That seems to be kind of the reality.
First off, I'm just glad Republicans are actually talking about this now. Affordability, home prices, grocery prices, etc. I mean, my mind just goes back to 2012. Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney. I mean, I just don't even think these things would have been talked about. And if they would have, you would have been called socialist for even bringing anything up. The government had anything to do with any of this in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I'm certainly, a free market guy, but, to a point. Yeah, and there's been some, I think, good criticism, because I think sometimes on the right, there's tends to be a too much of kind of, a black pill, or just, a very negative view. But I think the case remains, look, these are real issues that the country is facing. I mean, voters aren't just making this stuff up. E.J. Antoni, who he's a economist, he's at the Heritage Foundation, and I think a bunch of other places as well. I mean, he even looked at, he said nominal growth for median weekly earnings in Q3 was offset by price increases. So real earnings growth was flat. The affordability crisis that began in 2021 is very much so with us, and people are rightly angry that they fell behind for 4 years. You look at Warren Cass, and this was in 2018. So he did this study where you need 53 weeks. Essentially, it's called the Cost of Thriving Index, where you need 53 weeks to pay for a year's worth of just, basic kind of common goods, common household goods. So these things are real. Trump, I think, is starting to do some things about it, and has been doing some things. I think the question is timeline. Are they going to be sufficient to help? Certainly by 2026. I mean, just, in over, a couple of years from now, especially in those elections and the midterms, I think that's kind of the big question. But, I'm just glad that this is actually now a political issue, and not just kind of some species of economic historicism where, that's just history, housing prices are just shooting up. Well, that's just the economic gods talking to us. I'm very glad that that is not the prominent talking point of the Republican Party anymore.
Yeah, it's definitely going to, it's going to be, I think, one of Trump's central focuses. I think, we can sort of say now that the tariffs were a bit of a mixed bag in terms of their effects. I'm not an economist, but it does seem like it did not fix the problem the way it was advertised that they would. And yeah, we shall see whether Trump can kind of pull this one out. Like I said, he's obviously coming out of a president that did terrible damage to the economy in Biden. He's done some things that helped and some things that hurt, I think, so far. And as we see from polling, he is now going to be held responsible for what happens in the next 6 months, whether that's fair or not. So we'll see. But for now, we got to do a couple of cultural recommendations. When you were talking, Ryan, about how hard it is for young people to get into houses, I was thinking, I find it very difficult to get into houses, but then I don't own them. So maybe that's, oh, wait, you're talking about houses you own. And my house is currently, as we speak, being demolished out from under me. We've had a long process of getting the contractors lined up to do a remodel on the first floor of our house over here. Why do I bring this up? Because it is causing a weirdly meta symbiosis between my reading life and my physical embodied life. It's always an open question which one of those two things is more real for me. But at this particular moment, they are basically as one. I'm reading this novel called House of Leaves, which came out, I think in 2016. Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but it's relatively recent. And it's kind of a cult classic. It's a horror novel, which is why I was interested in it. It just feels like Advent season is a good time to be reading scary stories. But it comes in this big, heavy hardback, and you kind of have to get it that way because it's very postmodernist in its arrangement of text. Basically, the premise of this is the central story is that there's a house where if you go into a certain door, you enter the negative space of meaning, where rational thought breaks down and the hallways keep moving around, and there is this unseen but totally terrifying presence that devours everything within. So it's total zero, this house of negation and unmaking. However, this story is told as the story of let's see. It's a guy reporting on or delivering a novel that was written by another guy about a movie that doesn't actually exist. And the book that is about the movie is heavily footnoted and annotated in ways that become like increasingly bizarre. All of which is basically to say this is a very tricksy postmodernist sort of novel in which the book itself, the house becomes a metaphor for the book, and the book becomes a metaphor for the house, and both of them start eating themselves alive as you read them. If that sounds like incredibly annoying to you, ignore it. If that sounds a little bit fun, I will say there are actual jump scares in this novel. Like, it genuinely gets scary. And if you read it while your house is being taken apart, you will start to feel that you're going a little bit insane, which is my current state of affairs, even more than usual. I'm just not sure what the boundary is between fact and fiction. And so if I sound particularly unhinged on this podcast this week, that's why. Please rescue me from this incredibly bizarre endorsement, you guys. What are you reading or watching, or what's good?
For me, I mean, I am full bore into Advent. So my wife and I, we do kind of like morning prayer for our kids. So we do the Book of Common Prayer. So we're in this second Sunday in Advent, listening to Advent hymns, Advent maxing all over the place. So Lowy Comes with Clouds Descending. That's a famous one. St. John's College, Cambridge. There's actually quite a number of audio recordings from the 80s. Of their Advent services, which I would on YouTube, which I would highly recommend. Some great carols. So that is what I'm doing right now, and it's just a great time because, especially growing up, it just seemed like it was okay. You would go to church kind of maybe around Christmas Day, and then that was about it. And there was like almost nothing before and nothing really after. Epiphany wasn't part of my more kind of formative years. So it's just great to kind of have this extend, all the way through the December, and then, through parts of January too as well. So it is how it should be. So we are trying to form some of those traditions, especially in our household and especially with our kids too.
Awesome. All-timer of a liturgical season. It has the slight disadvantage that you don't get to be as festive in the ways that you remember leading up to Christmas. But then, and you must insist upon this, if you do the 4 weeks of Advent, you get 12 days of still Christmas until January 6th, Epiphany, Candlemas. And that kind of rocks.
Also known as my daughter's birthday. One of my daughter's birthdays, January 6th.
Insurrection baby.
Insurrection baby. She has that temperament too. So it's but as my colleagues remind me, no, come on, it's not Insurrection Day, it's Epiphany, which is quite right also. I do like
insurrection that in Satan's dominion, against Satan's dominion over the world. That's
right. Satan crying.
I like Advent maxing. It's a good one. Michael Knowles' joke the other day, maybe yesterday, he said, well, people are saying I should put Christmas decorations around the set for my show, but why would I put up Christmas decorations during Advent? So that's a deep cut Christian joke. I like it. I'm going to recommend a couple of horror thriller genre stuff, just because we had not enough time last week. For fans of the Predator franchise, I recommend, if you have not seen them yet, there's an animated short, a collection of animated shorts cobbled together into a kind of hour and a half animated movie called Predator Killer of Killers. It goes across time with predators descending upon Earth to hunt humans and getting vanquished. And then the plot gets interesting from there. It may involve a trip to the home planet of Predator Land, whatever that planet's called. There's a bunch of them now, including the, I guess it's a trilogy, sort of prequels from Ridley Scott that were out in the last 6 or 7 years or so. It's not every Predator property is awesome as a piece of cinema, but the last one I have to see, which I haven't seen, is Predator Badlands, where the Predator is kind of a protagonist. Anyway, I've always been a fan of the series, so for those that are and you're not caught up, go check them out. Fun stuff. And then I finally watched this horror movie that's getting a lot of play, or has been recommended to me a couple times, called Weapons. Everyone, one night at precisely 2:17 a.m. runs out of their house in a weird way with their arms outstretched. And that's the hook. And then I will warn you that this gets progressively more gory as you go through it. So if you don't like that sort of thing, Weapons is not for you. But it was an entertaining and intriguing in the sense of being original in this genre and something you haven't quite seen before, although it seems to involve witchcraft of some sort. But anyway, not uplifting.
Yeah,
movie.
as I said in our call earlier this week, that movie starts out, you're like, wow, the girl from Ozark sure is giving a great performance. And then it ends up with you like tearing your eyeballs out of their sockets as horrors unfold on screen. So I guess we're both of us, Ryan, recommending things for a select taste this week. Buyer beware.
We got to return to maybe more broadly appealing, a little more normie, straight ahead stuff for next week. So we'll work on it.
It's true. Mike was capital C Catholic in his tastes this week. We will have to be small c Catholic in our tastes next week. I'll recommend some sort of like Beanie Baby or something next week for everybody to enjoy. I keep saying that, but I probably won't. It'll probably be like an arcane medieval chant. In fact, it definitely is going to be an arcane medieval chant. I totally know it's going to be. Anyway, tune in next time for that excitement, and we will see you next week. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about everything we do, you can visit our websites at americanmind.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, where you will see not only the annual reading list. We have all our friends and contributors send in their favorite books of the year that they want to recommend at the end of the year, which is always lots of fun. But soon and very soon, there will be the long-awaited, long-foretold double issue for the 25th anniversary dropping on the website. Lots and lots of Christmas goodies for you to unpack at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. Also check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And donate if you feel so moved to support us at claremont.org/donate. We greatly appreciate all donations, large and small. Thanks, as always, to our production and engineering crew, Jake and Ryan Gannon, the Brothers G. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.